Alvin, in trying to understand reality, what our world is, you've come up with an idea that uses possible worlds, all the different ways the world could have been, as a way not just to have fun and think about science fiction ideas, but really to be probative of the nature of reality. How do possible worlds help us?
Well, the possible worlds are very useful in thinking about modality, necessity, possibility, contingency, and understanding what goes on in modality, what it is for an object to have a property essentially as opposed to having it accidentally, what it is for a proposition to be necessarily true as opposed to be just true but not necessary, or what it is for it to be necessarily false. And the notion of possible worlds is useful in a much broader context in thinking about what it is for human beings to be free, in thinking about whether it's possible both that God exists and be wholly good and so on, and that there be evil, in thinking about how it could, thinking about a kind of theodicy as to how it could be that God permits evil, what his reason for permitting evil is. So it's an interesting and important concept.
All right, let's figure this out. How can necessity be defined in terms of possible worlds?
Right. Let's go back, let's begin with a little puzzle. Bachelors are necessarily unmarried, one thinks, right? And Sam is a bachelor. Therefore, Sam is necessarily unmarried. And he can forget about looking for a wife. If he's necessarily unmarried, it's not logically possible he's going to get married, right? Well, I mean, there's got to be something wrong there. How can that be? Here's another similar example that Aquinas used, Thomas Aquinas, having to do with divine foreknowledge and human freedom. He says, whatever is seen to be standing is necessarily standing. So if God, the question is, how does God's foreknowledge, how does that comport with human freedom, you know? So, and Aquinas says, God's foreknowledge involves God's just seeing what happens. So he sees what happens. So he says, well, whatever is seen to be standing is necessarily standing. So suppose God sees that Theaetetus, I don't know why he came up with Theaetetus, we could say Sam. Suppose God sees that Sam is standing. Well, then Sam is necessarily standing, in which case Sam can't possibly sit down. This seems ridiculous, right? So possible worlds to the rescue. A possible world, first of all, is a way things could have been. Things could have been different in lots of ways. For example, you and I might not have been talking here together now. I might not have moved to Indiana but stayed in Michigan, or moved to China. You might have been a bit taller or a bit shorter. Things could have been different. All sorts of things could have been different in all sorts of different ways. And a possible world is a way things could have been, a total way things could have been. So it says something about everything, you know. And if you pick out a given possible world, then in that world I'll be a certain way and you'll be a certain way. And I don't know, the moon will be a certain way. Everything will be a certain way. Right. That's what a possible world is. Each of these are ways things could have been. And one of the ways things could have been is the way things actually are. That's the actual world, which we could name Alpha. Alpha is the name of the actual world, all right? Well, possible worlds help us think about what it is for a proposition to be necessary, or for an object to have a property essentially or necessarily. So a proposition is necessary just if it's true in every possible world. And I have a certain property essentially just if I have that property in every world in which I exist, every possible world in which I exist. You and I exist in lots of different possible worlds because lots of those ways things could have been include us. Some of them don't too, those are the impoverished ones, but lots of them do include us, so we exist in lots of different possible worlds. And I have a certain property essentially if and only if I have it in every world in which I exist. Now go back to that miserable little argument about Sam, who is essentially unmarried, necessarily unmarried. The first premise says bachelors are necessarily unmarried. Well, what that means in possible worlds talk, you might say, is everyone is such that he is unmarried in every world in which he's a bachelor. Or for anybody you pick out, if that person is a bachelor in a possible world, then in that same possible world, he's unmarried.
Mm-hmm.
But the conclusion was that Sam is in fact a bachelor. The conclusion, so Sam is necessarily unmarried, what that says is Sam is unmarried in every possible world, or every possible world in which he exists. And that just doesn't follow from his being a bachelor in the actual world. So it helps us see what the problem is there. And the same goes for the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom with Aquinas' argument there. So it's true that every world in which Theaetetus or Sam is seen to be standing is a world in which he's standing, but it just doesn't follow that he's necessarily standing, that he's standing in every possible world. Right.
So let's look at some of these possibilities. If in every world in which we exist, we have a certain property, then that property is to us essential, necessary. Yeah. Now let's say the reverse. Say in no world in which we exist, there's a property that we would have. Then what can we say about that property?
Well, then we have the opposite of that property, the complement of that property, essentially. We have that property in every world.
And let's say we have the property in only some of the worlds in which we could exist, or even one of the worlds.
Right. Yeah, then we have, those properties are ones we have contingently. Sometimes people say, going back to Aristotle, say accidentally, but that sort of suggests it's just by accident, which isn't really part of the idea. It's just that we have the property but could have lacked it. Right.